Howdy, how you doing? This is Mr. G coming at you with another segment, part 3 of
How does he do that?
We're going to call this episode Connecting the Dots. I've written a very basic um, Cantus Firma and a first species counterpoint part, and now we're going to connect the dots and make these parts a little bit more interesting. This is where it starts to get exciting. Um, Before we get to that, though, I need to bring up one little point, and I'm going to address this in more detail in another video. In order to compose, you've got to have something in your brain. You got to have something in your heart musically. And the only way to do that is to educate your ear. If you're going to compose classically, you should be listening to classical music. You should have a basic understanding for you, not necessarily an academic understanding, but you need to understand for you the things you need to be able to compose. For instance, sometimes I've been asked to compose music for a play, and I'm given very specific instructions in regards to I want it to be spooky, I want it to be frightening, I want it to be happy and carefree, I want dance music, I want a Elizabethan English type feel. I'm given these instructions, and I've got to know my craft as a musician well enough to know how to deliver those things. In that case, I'm taking the realm of music and imposing my will on it. I need to compose something scary, so I take those things that I know are scary and I put them together into a piece of music. I'm imposing my will on it. I know what instruments I want to use right off the bat. I know what instruments portray the emotion I want. I know musical modes and scales and harmonies that are spooky, scary, happy, carefree. Uh, and so I'm taking that information and I'm going to impose my will on it and produce a piece of music that meets their requirements. But there are other times, like this series, where I've taken a hymn, how This Is My Father's World, and I'm letting the music impose its will on me. And by that, I mean simply this. I take the melody, and I start composing a Cantus Firma and its basic counterpoint, which we did in the last lesson, with no specific endpoint in view. I don't have any I don't have any, how do I say this? I don't know what's going to happen. I'm letting the music impose its will. And that's what begins to happen in this lesson. We compose the basic parts, and then I start playing with it and connecting the dots, and we'll discover what that means. And then all of a sudden, the music starts to reveal itself. That's as zen-like as I'm going to get. The music starts to reveal itself, and it starts eliciting ideas, and I start saying, oh, I like this happen, and since I hear this, I want this to happen. And oh my goodness, this makes me hear this. And then it's like the music starts writing itself. But in order to have the ammunition to do all of that, I've had to do a lot of listening. I listen to a lot of classical music. Why? I'm starting to write classical music. Doesn't it make sense that I should understand what it sounds like? If you're going to be involved in this, you need to be listening to a lot of music. Listen to Beethoven, listen to Mozart, listen to Tchaikovsky, listen to Brahms, listen to Handel, listen to Bach. If there's a particular style of music you want to listen to, swamp yourself in it. Inundate yourself with it. Swim in it. Get used to hearing those sounds. Those sounds reproduce themselves in your music. All right. Enough of my soapbox. Let's get on with how does he do that? And let's connect the dots. This is where it starts to get fun. See you in a bit. Bye-bye. All right. I've got the Cantus Firma and the first species harmony acceptable to me. Now we're going to play a game that I like to call connecting the dots. Now what we do when I connect the dots is I take my inner voices, and anytime there's a big leap, I connect them. For instance, C goes down to G. In this one, C goes up to E, D goes up to F here, A goes down to F here. So what we're going to do is I am going to split these measures up and connect it, get from C to G in a stepwise motion. Now, here's the solution I came up with. Take a look at this. There we are. Here's your first measure. Do you remember where the first measure was before? C to G. Well, now take a look. I did a C with a dotted half and then eighth notes, B, A, G. Now, stepwise motion. Kind of cool. Now, in the third measure, take a look what happened. Third measure was an F, or an A, going down to an F. It's pretty simple. There's a step in between, two steps in between, A, G, and F. So I just did half notes, A to G to the F note. Now take a look at the bottom voice, the cello voice, or the viola, excuse me. I went from a C to an E here, then D to an F there. Well, let's take a look what I did. Let's take a look at my solution. C up to a D. And even though the second and third measure is only separated by a step, E down to D here, I put a little eighth note figure in here to get from E down to D. Why? Well, the other two voices are pretty much static. They're in place. There's no motion happening. So we got motion happening in the first measure of the melody. I put a little motion happening in the first measure of the second voice, second violin. And when those two voices are hanging out, I put motion in this voice, the viola voice. Now, excuse me, let's take a look at remember what I told you I went from, in this measure, in the first version, A down to F. Let's look at this. Here's my A. There was my F starting point. A, G, F. In my viola voice, we had a D to an F. What did I do there? Well, you're going to see I didn't do much. I delayed the F. I made the D here, extended it here, and it's at this point where I start looking at the big picture, the melody and everything, and I want to hear what sounds nice. Well, rather than go right directly to F on this measure like I did before, I noticed, well, there's an F here in this voice, and there's a D here. What if I just maintain this D here, make it sound like it's going to be a D minor chord, and then I switch up to F here. So let's hear the first four measures before and the first four measures now. Here's first four. Alright. Oops, where are we at here? My bad. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now let's come back and listen to the first four measures with the moving parts. Here we go. Here we are. Isn't that cool? Now, notice on 1, 2, 3, 4, the fourth measure, the second violin part right there. Let's take a look at it. 1, 2, what we got here? 1, 2, 3, 4. There we are. F is going to a G in the second violin part. Here's the F, and here's the G. I borrowed a trick from the other voice, and I decided, how am I going to connect the F, G? I want motion. Why? Because I've decided that there isn't much motion happening in the viola voice, and the melody is staying static, so let's put some motion in a different voice. Again, you can see this pattern emerging. Motion in the top voice, the melody, a little, and then a little motion. Oop, hang on a second. Goodbye. A little motion here. Then I decided, and a little motion here. Then I put motion down here in this voice. And now it followed up. There's motion in the top voice. And then back to motion in the middle voice. Right? And now the top voice has motion again. So you can see how all of a sudden the movement is kind of just poking its head up from different places. Now, just a brief little interjection here. One of the most important parts in music is an element called call and response. We hear this in blues bands a lot. I'm in a blues band. So when people are trading solos back and forth, one guy will say something on his instrument, and the other guy will answer him, and they go back and forth. Call and response. In this context, I'm thinking in terms of call and response in the sense of motion in one voice, answered by motion in another voice, answered by motion in another voice. It's kind of like a sentence, or it's kind of like a conversation. Have you ever tried to talk to somebody who wouldn't shut up? Or have you ever been in a room where everybody's talking all at once and it gets all combobulated and you can't make sense of anything? Well, the temptation in music is because we have so many cool things we can do is to have everybody doing cool things all at once and it gets lost. I like to keep it simple. I like to have one voice saying something and then another voice and then another voice. And here we have the melody in the first violin, another harmony part in second violin, and another harmony part in the cello part, or the viola, excuse me. And I'm having those guys trade sentences, and then they pause. When you have a conversation with someone else, you speak, they listen. They speak, you stop talking, and you listen. That's the feeling I'm getting at here. Call and response. All right, let's get back to it. Let's go to the second 4 bars of this thing. 1, 2, 3, 4. We got a G going to a B here, and an E going to a D here. What did I do? Well, I bet you can figure out. G here, and I decided not to go to a B. I went to an A. I changed it. Why? I didn't like the way it sounded. G. And besides, I went right there. I went from a C down to a G. There's a skip. Well, if you're going to do a skip down, I need to step up. And I did. Okay, here's an example of the music imposing its will on me. I came up with this line that I liked, where I went from, I went up to that C in that measure, and then I skipped down to the G. Well, the note I originally had in the cantus was a B. Well, see that the skip from a C down to the G, followed by a skip up to the B, that's kind of disjointed. If you sing the line by itself, you find out that it doesn't sound right by itself. And the goal of writing music with multiple parts is that each one of the parts should be able to be sung or played by itself, and it should be a fairly interesting line, and it should make sense musically. 2 skips in a row generally makes things sound disjointed. And if it sounds improper by itself, odds are it's going to be a hard problem. It's going to present hard problems when it comes to harmonizing and making things work. So I chose instead, if I went from a C down to the G, I employed that rule of voice leading in Cantus Firma and counterpoint, skip down, step up. I skipped down from the C down to the G, so instead of skipping to a B, I just moved up a step to an A. Problem solved. This is an example of me being willing to change and morph this thing because now the music is starting to write itself. Okay? Back at it. Here we go. Now, Did I do anything with the other voice? Well, let's take a peek. Let's go back here. I had a D here. I'm sorry, I had an E here going to a D in that measure. I have an E here. I changed the D to an F, again, because I didn't like the way it sounded originally. And it started to make more sense to me. Also, so I went from E, D, F, D up to an F means skip up, step down. I did. There's my E. And again, you take a look here. I did on this voice here, I did quarter, quarter, half. In the second voice, half, quarter, quarter. I reversed the rhythm a little bit to give it a little bit more a variety. So let's see. And there's numbers of solutions that you can use with this stuff. This is just what fit for me. Let's try it. Cool. All right. See what we've done so far? We took a melody, wrote a very basic whole note, one note per measure, Cantus Firma, and a second counterpoint part. And based on those notes, then we fiddled with it, we connected the dots. We took the leaps and connected them so that almost everything is pretty much in stepwise motion. And that's really what's most pleasing to the ear. And you can see how this piece is beginning to take shape. Now the next step is going to be, we're going to apply the same process to the second half, the B section, or the chorus, if you will, of This Is My Father's World. And we're also going to be working with the bass voice. Now we still got two instruments to write for, a cello and a double bass. And we'll cover that in the next lesson. But thanks for listening to the next edition of
How does he do that?
Mr. G. Bye-bye.